Teflon Daniel Andrews has escaped adverse findings against him in a 5-year corruption probe, but he hasn't escaped criticism. The Victorian Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission investigation, released today, unearths a cash-for-access culture. It details how property developer John Woodman used political donations to buy access to the Premier and senior ministers in the Andrews government. IBAC describes it as using donations to buy privileged access. Andrews has a long history with John Woodman, accused of buying the access. Woodman told journalist Damon Johnston last year that he's known Andrews since he had pimples on his face. IBAC's findings state, and I quote, "In his evidence to IBAC, the Premier acknowledged that over time he had been to many fundraising functions such as progressive business, Premier and Cabinet dinners and a lunch at a restaurant with Mr Woodman and his associates, as mentioned above. However, during examination, the Premier stated that he had no recollection of Mr Woodman or his associates raising planning matters with him. No recollection." The opposition today made the point that this is yet another probe with yet another damning verdict on the Andrews government culture.
5 reports, 5 anti-corruption commission reports in the last 12 months. It's a damning indictment of the culture of corruption and secrecy and cover-up that we see from the Andrews Labor government day in and day out.
Well, while IBAC was tapping phones and investigating this in secret, journalists were pursuing the story of the property developer John Woodman using political donations to try get favourable rezoning and planning decisions made. One of those journalists, Royce Miller from The Age, was breaking stories that raised concerns about Woodman buying access to local councils. It was good investigative journalism that's absolutely in the public interest. And you'd think a journalist would deserve praise for breaking stories like this. But here's what Daniel Andrews reportedly said, according to a conversation picked up on a phone tap. And I quote, "In a lawfully intercepted conversation between Mr Standel and Mr Woodman on the 4th of March 2019, Mr Standel described a conversation he had with the Premier at a function on February 2019. He said the Premier praised Mr Woodman's contribution to the Labor Party and lamented the fact that Woodman was being pursued with allegations of corruption by a journalist who was an arsehole. Mr Standel said the Premier asked him to apologise to Woodman for the Minister for Planning's deferral of their decision on Amendment C219 because of those allegations." Well, this is quite the conversation to be recorded on a phone tap. The Premier apparently conveying an apology to this dodgy property developer, John Woodman, that one of his developments wasn't approved. Well, IBAC asked the Premier about this phone intercept at a secret hearing. The Premier stated that he could not recollect the content of the conversation with Standel, nor having a conversation with him on that particular occasion at all. But he said there were some things that Standel had recounted to Woodman that did not ring true or sit well with him. The Premier said it was not his practice to speak about journalists in the terms alleged. The Premier considered it highly unlikely that he would have wanted to have Standel convey an apology for the decision being deferred. Now, here's what's even more fascinating than all of this. The corruption agency took the property developer's word about this apology rather than Daniel Andrews. And it's a point the opposition was scathing about today.
For an integrity agency, when confronted with different accounts of what actually happened, to actually say we prefer the account of the lobbyist is damning of Daniel Andrews. It says that he can't be believed. And what's that message to all Victorians? We have a Premier who isn't believed by our anti-corruption body, and that is a damning indictment on Daniel Andrews.
You'll also notice that when Daniel Andrews gave his account in the secret hearing with IBAC that he said he couldn't recall that conversation at all. Well, I was chatting to Steve Price today, and he made the point that Andrews often seems not to recall things. He said Daniel Andrews couldn't remember who chose the security firm that bungled the hotel security during the pandemic, and that Andrews refused to answer questions about his mysterious fall down slippery steps, injuring his back. Andrews more recently won't say where he got the $7 billion figure from for the Commonwealth Games. Back to the IBAC report, it today also states, and I quote, "The Premier said that he knew Mr Woodman and was aware he had made substantial donations to the party. He accepted it was possible that he had acknowledged Woodman's donations to the Labor Party when speaking with Standal. The Premier accepted that he would not have had an interest in alienating Woodman as a donor to the Labor Party." The report made adverse findings against 2 councillors who pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from Woodman in return for favourable planning decisions. And it wasn't just Labor figures implicated, Liberals also received donations. These findings, the result of 5 years, 40 days of public hearings and 7 secret examinations.
Suspicion that the person who's being interviewed has engaged in corrupt conduct, has done the wrong thing. I have never been examined in public, and you ought infer from that, not even a matter of inference, it's a matter of fact, because I've not done anything wrong.
Oh, his press conference today was typical, as they always are, shrugging off any suggestion of wrongdoing, and there were no adverse findings against him personally, as I've said. Now, Damon Johnston, who's been leading the way with his coverage of this issue, makes the point that while Casey councillors were grilled in public by the anti-corruption agency, Daniel Andrews was afforded the luxury of a private examination. So why the special treatment?
It's a real shame that Victorians didn't get to hear the evidence that the Premier gave. In just about any other state with an anti-corruption commission, they would have seen it in public. But remember, the first thing Daniel Andrews did after he won the 2018 state election was to change the law to make it harder, much harder, for public hearings to take place.
As I said, there were no adverse findings against the Premier himself. But here is yet another probe with a damning verdict about the culture in Victoria and in the Labor Party. It's this culture that brought dodgy figures access to Daniel Andrews and his ministers. Culturally, it's a scathing indictment. Andrews has run the ALP for some 14 years. He has to take responsibility for the culture that allowed someone like Woodman to buy privileged access. That's the term IBAC has used, privileged access. It's Andrews' own culture. He's created it and thrived in it.
Under the Andrews government, there have been numerous IBAC and Ombudsman's reports that point to wrongdoing, behaviour which shows a lack of integrity, a lack of process and governance around important matters like planning decisions in this case. So we don't believe that Daniel Andrews is the person who should have more planning power. If there's any suggestion by Daniel Andrews or anyone in his government that the answer to today's scathing report of his own conduct is to give him more planning power, well, I'll say to Victorians, we cannot trust the Premier because he never takes responsibility and he shouldn't be given more responsibility for planning decisions.